Hops. Honestly, I could dedicate 2 or 3 of these episodes just to hops alone. There are over 100 different types of hops. They come from the nettle family of plants, and they're related to marijuana, believe it or not. But they're used to, obviously with the malts you get all your sugar, sweetness, and that fruity type, that dark fruit type flavour, so sweet type flavours. Hops will counterbalance that with their bitter flavours. So what sort of flavours do you get from hops? Well, it all depends. It's like water, it depends on the region they're grown. Usually they are grown and they will take on the characteristics of the earth, of the climate, etc. I don't want to go too much into the science of it, but you get the gist. I know that a lot of countries, especially America, they've adopted a lot of European hops and grown them over there, and they taste different. So your location has a lot to do with the way hops will taste. As I say, there's over 100 types of hops, each one different, each one with its own characteristic. Some are used to make beer bitter, to counteract the sweetness from the malt. Others are used to add flavour. Now, what sort of flavours do you get? Well, again, it goes by region. American hops will usually or typically have pine flavour, citrus, tropical fruit, and you'll get that bitter note. So if you've ever had a West Coast IPA or an East Coast IPA, and that bitterness, that's all coming from them American hops. British hops have a slightly different characteristic. They've also got fruit, but they've also got a fair amount of spice in them as well, certain types, and they will give you like a herbal and woody type note to some of the beers as well. Kent, where I come from now, is particularly renowned for its hops, and if you've ever heard of Goldings, East Kent Goldings, Fuggle hops, they originate from Kent, and they're widely used in beers both in the UK and in America. German and Czech hops again have their different characteristics. They have what's called noble hops, and these are the hops that are used in lager and pilsner beer. If you've ever heard of Saaz hops, they are perhaps one of the most famous hops, and they're used in a lot of beers across the board, especially lagers, but especially the pilsner type lagers. They're all from the Czech region. Pilsen is in the Czech Republic, and they grow these Saaz hops, and these are very sort of herbal, and so you can even say sometimes you get like a very minty type flavour off them. I've never got that, but I know people that have said, you know, some certain like German and Czech hops that taste minty, but you also get that sort of lemon type citrus to it as well. They have that characteristic in it too. Also pepper. Now you can get spice in from a lot of hops, but you do get that from German and Czech hops. Again, this is all to do with the characteristics of the soil, the environment, etc., the climate, and so forth. That is just a brief overview of hops. So when I talk about citrus, when I talk about like tropical fruit, when I talk about spiciness, when I talk like herbs, when I talk about earth flavours, when I talk about certain bitterness, that's all coming from the hops, okay? And that is their characteristic. They're basically used to counteract the sweetness of the malt. Yeast. Now this is a really important part of beer. If you can imagine malt and hops and water being the petrol, yeast is the match that lights the spark that makes everything work in the brewing process. What is yeast? Yeast is found everywhere, apparently. it's like a bacteria type thing. There's numerous different kinds of yeast, and they all have different consequences, if you know what I mean. If your missus has ever had a yeast infection, yeast can do that. You can't brew beer with that, by the way, so don't try it. As far as brewing's concerned, you get two types. You get a lager yeast and you get ale yeast. I mean, that's not the official term, but that's what I like to refer to them as. Why are they called that? They basically work at two different temperatures. So if you have a lager yeast, that will work at a lower temperature. These temperatures are about 4 to 7 degrees, something like that. Usually this is like light beers, lagers. This is what they'll use. They're called bottom fermented lagers, and the reason they're called bottom fermented, it means that the temperature is low during the fermentation process. Okay, they don't really have a flavour, lager yeasts. They are just there to provide the chemical reaction during the brewing process. Ale yeast, that is the other type, and these are known as top fermenters. They have a lot of flavour, you get a lot of fruit from them, you get spice, and you also get high alcohol yield from them. Where does that come from? Well, as I say, yeast will turn the sugar into alcohol, and how it does this is yeast floats around in the fermentation tanks. As I say, they're little bacteria, and this is going to sound pretty disgusting, but they burp carbon dioxide, which gives it natural carbonation. If you've heard the term natural carbonation, this is where that comes from. It will come from the yeast. Now, when I say beer has got a nice mouthfeel, they're usually naturally carbonated. So what I'm drinking is the burps from a yeast, or what everyone's drinking is the burps from a yeast. Sounds disgusting. This next bit is even more disgusting. These yeast will puke and piss alcohol, as well as creating it from this. Well, they digest the sugar, and that's what they create. They create puke and they create piss, which is alcohol. If that doesn't put you off your beer, nothing will. But this is the very, very basics of the brewing process. I'm not going to go into it. I don't know enough about it, to be honest, but this is what happens. As I say, there's more flavour that comes from the top fermented, or the yeast that works at higher temperature, than there is from the bottom fermented yeast, which is the lager yeast. Then of course you get the yeast, specialty yeasts that you get in wheat beer, which produce that banana and clove flavour. I mean, they're doing the same as the other yeasts, you know, they are producing alcohol, but they also produce flavour as well, and they give you that fruity and that spicy ester that you get characteristic of a wheat beer. If you've ever heard of lambic beer, that is just something that has been created by the mad professor, if you like, who's just torn the rule book up, and they've just put stuff in there. They put wild yeast, they put bacteria in there, they put fruit in there, and it creates all sorts of havoc, and the byproduct is a very, very nice drink. I've reviewed a couple of lambics, so I haven't posted them up. I will do. Honestly, I could do a whole program about the whole brewing process of a lambic, but yeast is a massive part of that as well, and it's a massive part of all the beers. One downside to that is one of the byproducts, as well as alcohol, is something called diacetyl. Now, diacetyl is not particularly desirable in beer. Diacetyl is hard to describe the flavour. It's more of a, it tastes like butter, if you can, or fat. If you can imagine that, if you've ever had a pint and you've got like a buttery feel, not in a good way either. I don't like it. It's not that great, but some people might like it. It's there though. You will find that more in ales and dark beers than you will with lager. And when lager is stored, it will the yeast will reabsorb that diacetyl. But yeah, that is yeast summed up.